The Sums That Came Right by E Nesbit. If 27 barrels full of apples cost £25, 13 shillings and threepence, what would the same barrels be worth if they had been packed by a dishonest person, who only put in 7/9 of apples in each barrel, and the rest sawdust? This was the sum. It does not look very hard, perhaps, to you who have studied ardently for years at a board school or high school or a preparatory school for the sons of gentlemen. But to Edwin it looked as hard as a ship's biscuit. But he went for it like a man, and presently produced an answer, and his master wrote a big curly R across the sum. Perhaps you do not know that a big curly R means right. As for the answer to the sum, I will try to get a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, who is a very terribly clever person, to work it out for you, and if he can do it, I will put the answer at the end of this story. I cannot work it out myself. Edwin was glad to see the large curly R. He saw it so seldom that to meet it was a real pleasure. But what's the use? He said. Everything else leads to something else except lessons. If you put seeds in the garden, they come up flowers, unless they're rotten seeds or you forgot where you put them. And if you buy a rabbit, well, there it is, unless it dies. And if you eat your dinner, well, you're not hungry any more for an hour or two. But lessons. He bit his penholder angrily and put his head into his desk to look for nibs to play Simpkins Minor with. You know the game of nibs, of course. He held up the lid of the desk on his head, as I dare say you have often done, and the inside of the desk was darkish, so that the sudden light at the very back of the desk showed quite brightly and unmistakably. Those firework fuses, so crikey, was Edwin's first thought. But it was no firework fusee. It was like glowworms, only 1,000 times more bright and white, for it was the light of pure reason, and it glowed from the glorious eyes of the arithmetic fairy. You did not know that there was an arithmetic fairy, did you? If you knew as much as I do, it would be simply silly for me to try to tell you stories, now wouldn't it? Her wonderful eyes gleamed and flashed straight into the round, goggling eyes of the amazed Edwin. "Upon my word," she said. Edwin said nothing. "Did no one ever tell you?" the fairy went on, shaking out her dress which was woven of the integral calculus and trimmed with a dazzling fringe of logarithms. Did no one ever tell you that the things that happen when you've done your sums right happen when you're grown up? I don't care what happens then, Edwin dared to say, for the flashing eyes were kind eyes. I shall be a pirate, or a bushranger, or something. The fairy drew herself up, and her graceful garland of simple equations trembled as Edwin breathed heavily. A pirate, said she, a nice sort of pirate who can't calculate his men's share of the plunder to 3/17 of a gold link of the dead captain's chain. A fine bushranger who can't arrange the 42 bullets from the revolver of his 7 dauntless followers, so that each of the 15 enemies gets his fair share. Go along with you, said the arithmetic fairy. But Edwin's eyes were, as I said, wide open, goggling. I say, he suddenly remarked, how jolly pretty you are. The arithmetic fairy has but one weakness, a feminine weakness. She loves a pretty speech. If blunt, so much the worse. Yet even bluntness. She looked down and played shyly with the bunch of miscellaneous examples in vulgar fractions which adorned her waistband. I suppose you can't be expected to understand yet, she said, and she said it very gently. Edwin took courage. When I do things, I want something to happen at once. I want a white rabbit, and I want it now. She did not recognize the quotation. Get your master to set you a little simple multiplication sum with white rabbits, she said. Goodbye, my child. You'll know me better in time, and as I know you, and as you know me better, you'll love me more. You're lovely now, said Edwin. The fairy laughed and spread her dazzling wings, glistening with all the glories of the higher mathematics. Edwin closed dazzled eyes and opened them as the desk lid shut down on his head, swayed by no uncertain hand. It was the mathematical master's hand, in fact. A new example was set, and curiously enough, white rabbits were in it. If 7,563 white rabbits, it began. Edwin, his brain in a whirl, worked it correctly by a sort of inspiration, like an ancient prophet or calculating machine. When he returned with his books in a strap to the red villa whose gables meant home for him, he found an excited crowd dancing round the white painted gates. The whole of the front garden, as well as most of the back garden, was a seething mass of white rabbits. 7,563 there were, to be exact. I alone know this. The joyous Edwin and his distracted parents were never able to count them. What a lot of hutches we shall want, Edwin thought gaily. But when his father came home from the stock exchange, where he spent his day considering 7 and 10, 3 by 32, no doubt under the direct guidance of the arithmetic fairy, he said at once, "Send for the poulterer." This was done. Only one pair of white rabbits remained the property of Edwin, but these, by the power of the arithmetic fairy, became 10 by Christmas. The rabbits disposed of, peace spread a longing wing over the villa, but it was not allowed to settle. "Oh, please, the startled cook, cap all crooked, exclaimed in the hall. "The cellar is choke full of apples, most of 'em bad. I never seen no one deliver 'em, nor yet give no receipt." The cook, for once in a lurid career, spoke truth. The cellar was full of apples, 19 pounds 19 and twopence and 1/3 of a pennyworth, to be accurate. Edwin went to bed, feeling now quite sure he had not dreamt the arithmetic fairy, and anxiously wondering what tomorrow's sums would be about. Not, he trusted, about snakes or Sunday school teachers. The next day's sum was about oranges. Edwin did it correctly, and went home a prey to the most golden apprehensions. Nor were these unfounded. The whole of the dining room and most of the hall, up to the 17th step of the neatly carpeted stairs, was golden with oranges. Edwin's father said some severe things about practical jokes, and sent for the greengrocer. Edwin ate 9 3/7 oranges, and went to bed yellow, but not absolutely unhappy. But now he was quite sure. On the following day his sum dealt with elephants, and in such numbers that his father, on returning from business, yielded to a very natural annoyance, and gave notice to his landlord that he should, at Lady Day, leave a villa where elephants and oranges occurred to such an extent. No one suspected Edwin of having anything to do with these happenings, and indeed it was not his fault. So how and why could or should he have owned up to it? I wish I had time to tell you of the events that occurred when Edwin's sums were set in buttered muffins of the 75 pigs travelling in a circle at varying rates, I can only say that part of this circle ran through Edwin's mother's drawing-room. Nor can I here relate the tale of the 300 lightning conductors which were suddenly found to be attached to the once happy villa home. Edwin's mother cried all day when she was not laughing, and people came from far and near to see the haunted house. For when it came to 4,000 white owls and a church steeple, everyone felt that this was more than a mere accident. Edwin's master had a pretty taste in sums, and about once a term he used to set a sum about cranes. Edwin worked that sum wrong on purpose, so I suppose it served him right that the cranes should be at home before he was, just as they would have been if he had worked the sum properly. And as he borrowed his father's razor that morning to sharpen a slate pencil, the 57 cranes were not all thrown away. But it was the sum about the cistern that convinced Edward of the desperate need of finding the arithmetic fairy, and begging her to take back the present she had made him. It is not polite to ask this, but Edwin had to. You see, in the sum the cistern had to leak 3 pints in 13 minutes and a quarter, but the cistern at home happened to have a little leak of its own already, where Edwin had tried his new drill on it, and the 2 leaks together managed so well that when Edwin got home he found water dripping from all the top bedroom ceilings, and the staircase was a sort of Niagara. It was very exciting, but when the plumber came, he let Edwin's father know all about the little drill hole, and Edwin got the credit of the leak in the sum, which was much larger and most unfair. His father spoke to Edwin about this matter in his study, and it was then that Edwin saw that he must put an end to the sums that come true. So he went to his bedroom with his candle and his arithmetic book. Directly he put the candle on the chest of drawers, a big splash of water from the ceiling fell right on the flame, and it went out. He had to go right downstairs to get another light, but when he put the candle on the dressing table, splash, out it went. Chair, splash, out. At last he got the candle to stay alight on the wash-hand stand, which was, by some curious accident, the only dry place in the room. Then he opened his book. Somewhere in the book, he knew, there must be something that would fetch the fairy. He said the multiplication table up to 9 times. After that, as you know, the worst is over. but no fairy appeared. Then he read aloud the instructions for working the different rules, including the examples given. There was no result. Then he called to the fairy, but she did not come. Then he tried counting, then counting and calling mixed with other things like, "Oh, good fairy, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, do come and help me, 8, 9, 10, 11, beautiful, dear, kind, lovely fairy, 9 nines are 81, dear fairy, do come, 7,200,659. I will always love you if you will come to me now. 3/17 of 5/9 of 5/12 of 16/15. You were so kind the other day. 2 and 2 are 4, and 3 are 7. Do come now. You've no idea what an awful mess you've got me into. 7 nines are 63, though I know you meant it kindly. Dear fairy, 13 from 37 leaves 24. Do come and see what a hole I'm in. Do come, and the product will give you the desired results." Edwin stopped, out of breath. He looked round for the fairy, but his room, with the water dripping from the roof and the wet towels and basins on the floor, was not a fairy-like place. Edwin saw with a sigh that this was no go. "I'll have another go in prep tomorrow," he said. This he did. The mathematical master was pleased with himself that day, because he had succeeded in preventing his best boy from yielding to the allurements of the head master and the classical side. Of course, his class knew at once what kind of temper the mathematical master was in. You know, we always know that. And Edwin ventured to ask that the examples of the day might be about a model steam engine. "Only one, please, sir," he was careful to explain. The master kindly consented, and by great good fortune the example did not deal with a faulty boiler, nor with any other defect, but concerned itself solely with the model engine's speed. So Edwin knew, when he had worked his sum, exactly what pace the model engine he would find at home would be good for. He worked the sum right. Then he put his head into his desk and began again. "Oh, good fairy, if a sum of £4,700 is to be divided by A, B, and C, do come and help me. 3/10 of a pound is 6 shillings, dear fairy. 11, 12, 13, 14, oh lovely fairy," and so on. But no fairy came, and Simpkins minor whispered, "What are you chuntering about?" and stuck a pin into Edwin's leg. "Can't you do the beastly example?" Then, quite suddenly, Edwin knew what he had to do. He made up an example for himself. This was it. If 7,535 fairies were in my desk at school, and I subtracted 710 and added 1006, and the rest flew away in 783 equal gangs, how many would be left over in the desk? When he had worked it out, the answer was 1. Very quickly he opened his desk again, and there was the arithmetic fairy, looking more lovely than ever in a rich gown of indices lined with surds that fell to her feet in oscillating curves. In her hand, like a sceptre, shone the starry glory of her binomial theorem, but her eyes were starrier still. She smiled, but her first words were severe. "You careless boy," she said, "why can't you learn to be accurate? It's the merest chance you got me. You should have stated your problem more clearly, and you should have said 7,000 arithmetic fairies. Why, suppose you had found one fairy in your desk, and it had been the grammar fairy or the football fairy. What would you have done?" "Is there a football fairy?" Edwin asked. "Of course. There's a fairy for everything you have to learn. There's a patience fairy, and a good temper fairy, and a fairy to teach people to make bread, and another to teach them to make love. Didn't you really know that?" "No," said Edwin, "but I say, look here." "I'm looking," she said, fixing her bright eyes on Edwin's goggling ones, exactly as at their first meeting. "No, I mean, oh, I say," he said. "So I hear," she said. "No, but no, kid," he said. "Of course there isn't any kid," said she. "Dear, kind, pretty fairy," Edwin began again. "That's better," said the fairy. "Didn't you hear all I was saying to you yesterday, when the water was dripping from the ceiling all over the room? From 19 several spots, of course I did." "Well then," said Edwin, "you mean that you're tired of having things happen when you do your sums correctly. You prefer the old way." "Yes, please," said Edwin, "if you're sure you don't mind. I know you meant it for kindness, but, oh, it's most beastly when you get into the thick of it." He was thinking of the elephants, I fancy. "I only did it to please you," said the fairy. "I'll make everything as it was before. Does that please you? And there's your third wish. You know, we always give 3 wishes. It's customary in the profession. What would you like?" Edwin had not attended properly to this speech, so he only heard as it was before, and then, "What would you like?" So he said, "I should like to see you again some day." The arithmetic fairy smiled at him, and her beauty grew more and more radiant. She had not expected this. "I was sure you would ask for a pony or a cricket bat or a pair of white mice," she said. "You shall see me again, Edwin. Goodbye." And the bright vision faded away in a dim mist of rosy permutations. When Edwin got home, he heard that a model engine had been discovered in the larder and had been given to his younger brother. There are some wrongs, some sorrows, to which even a pen like mine cannot hope to do justice. Edwin is now a quiet-looking, grown-up person in a black frock coat, and his hair is slowly withdrawing itself from the top of his learned head. I suppose it feels itself unworthy to cover so great a brain. The fairy has been with him unseen this many a year. The other day he saw her. He had been senior wrangler, of course. That was nothing to Edwin. And he was astronomer royal, but that, after all, he had a right to expect. But it was when he took breath from his researches one day and suddenly found that he had invented a brand new hypernebular hypothesis that he thought of the fairy, and thinking of her, he beheld her. She was lightly poised above a pile of books based on Newton's Principia, and topped with his own latest work, the fourth and further dimensions. He knew her at once, and now he appreciated more than ever than in his youth the radiance of her eyes and wings, for now he understood it. "Dear, beautiful fairy," he said, "how glad I am to see you again." "I've been with you all the time," she said. "I wish I could do something more for you. Is there anything you want?" The great mathematician, who was Edwin, ran his hand over his thin hair. "No," he said, "no." And then he remembered the school and Simpkins Minor and the old desk he had used to keep firework fuses in. "Unless," he added, "you could make me young again." She dropped a little tear, clear as a solved problem. "I can't do that," she said. "You can't have everything. The only person who could do that for you is the love fairy. If you had found her instead of me, you would have been always young, but you wouldn't have invented the hypernebular hypothesis." "I suppose I shall never find her now," said Edwin. As he spoke, he looked out of the window to the garden, where a girl was gathering roses. "I wonder," said she. "The love fairy doesn't live in school desks or books or on fourth dimensions." "I wonder," said Edwin. Does the love fairy live in gardens? I wonder, echoed the arithmetic fairy, a little sadly, and she spread her bright wings and flew out of the open window and out of this story. Edwin went out into the rose garden, and did he find the love fairy? I wonder. By the way, the fellow of Trinity College says the answer to the sum is £19, 19 shillings and twopence, and 1/3 of a penny. Does the fellow of Trinity speak the truth? I wonder. The Plush Usurper. There was a knock at the king's study door. The king looked up from his plans for the new municipal wash houses and sighed. For that was the 27th knock that had come to his door since breakfast. "Come in," said the king wearily, and the Lord Chief Good-doer came in. He wore a white gown and carried a white wand. If you had been there, you would have noticed how clean the king's study looked. All the books were bound in white vellum, and the floor was covered with white matting, and the curtains were of white silk. Of course, it would not be right for everyone to have such things, even if we were all kings, because it would make such a lot of work for the servants. But this king, whose name was Alban, had an excellent housekeeper. She did all the cooking and cleaned everything by white magic, which is better than even nettoyage sec, if you know what that is, and only took the good lady 5 minutes every morning. "I am extremely sorry to disturb your majesty," said the Lord Chief Good-doer, "but your majesty's long-lost brother Negretti has called in from the Golden Indies, and he says he can't stay more than half an hour." The king jumped up, knocking over the white wood table where the white books were. We call them blue books in England, but the insides are just as dull, whatever colour you put outside. "My dear brother, I haven't seen him since we were boys together," he cried, and ran out to meet him, tucking up his royal white velvet robes to run the quicker down the cool marble corridors. At the front door of the palace was the king's brother, just getting down from his elephant. He was a brown and yellow brother, withered and shriveled like a very old apple, and dressed in a plush suit of bright orange, sewn thick with emeralds. All the white marble terrace in front of the palace was crowded with the retinue of the new arrival. Slaves nymphs of all colours, black, brown, yellow and cream-coloured, dressed in all sorts of bright hues, scarlet and blue, and purple and orange, with rubies and sapphires, and amethysts and topazes sewn thickly on them, so that the eye could hardly bear the glow and glitter of them as they shone in the sunlight on the terrace. "Welcome, welcome," King Alban cried, and kissed his brother on both cheeks, as is the fashion in Albanatolia and many other civilized lands. Then, still holding him by both hands, he led him into the palace. The jewelled, gorgeous retinue followed him in, and the head parlour-maid shut the front door and put the chain up, because she knew it to be more than possible that a few odd rubies and sapphires and things would drop off the retinue on to the floor, and she thought that any such little odds and ends might as well go into her dustpan when she swept up after lunch, as into the pockets of any poor people who might look in during the afternoon to ask the king's advice, as they were fond of doing. This was the beginning of the trouble that was wrought by the coming of the king's brother. Before this, every door stood unfastened all day long, because everyone was contented, and therefore honest. King Alban entertained his brother royally for 7 days in the good old fashion, and then gave him a palace of his own to live in. The palace was of white marble, like most of the buildings in Albanatolia, but the king's brother had it painted red all over without a moment's delay. And then he began to give parties and to have processions and to scatter money among the crowd, and every day the people loved him more. He was a loud, jolly, joking sort of man, with a black beard, and he always wore clothes of plush, a material hitherto unknown, and he always blazed with jewels, and he had a circus set up at his own expense in the field at the back of his palace, and he introduced horse racing and animated photographs, all highly coloured, and thus became extraordinarily popular, so much so that the people presently began to forget all the good that King Alban had done for them, and to wish secretly that the kingdom had happened to have a bright, cheerful king like Prince Negretti. For King Alban had worked so hard for his people's good that he had not had time to be amusing. He had never had processions and circuses, preferring rather small tea parties with the Lord Chief Good-doer, the Commissioner of Public Health, and a few chosen spirits from the Education Department. and loving best of all to wander alone, dreaming among the blossoming orchards, or in the meadows beyond the river where the white jonquils grew, or in the lane between the pearly may bushes, or in the terraced garden of his palace where the white roses hung in heavy scented clusters, and the white peacocks spread their tails upon the marble balustrades. And wherever he went, he thought of the people's good, and devised new ways of making them comfortable. Everything was beautifully managed. Everyone had enough to wear, and enough to eat, and enough to do, which is very important. But they had not enough to play at, and this was what made them ready to lend long and discontented ears to the whispers of the king's brother. Now Negretti was a magician, and his was the black or coloured magic which won't wash clothes. He was always messing about with acids and alkalis, sulphites and bicarbonates, and retorts and furnaces, and test tubes, and pestles and mortars, and the like. And whenever he happened to make a nice colour by mixing two of these things together, he always put it in a bottle and stuck it up in one of the palace windows, so that at night his windows were brighter than any chemist's and druggists in the street, and the people said that it was as good as fireworks. The king's palace window only sent out a soft white light like moonlight, and this was now considered very tame. It was the magician's habit to wander about the town, stirring up discontent as easily if it had been one of his chemical messes. And though he was well known among the people, he was never recognized, because he always took care to disguise himself as a respectable person, and the disguise was quite impenetrable. One night he sat disguised at the king's head, the finest of the municipal ale-houses, drinking dog's nose out of a pewter pot, and the grumbling people was music to his wicked ears. "Alban is not my sort of king," said the blacksmith. "I'd make a better king out of a penn'orth of putty any day of the week," said the painter. "What's the good of a king if you never see him?" said the landlady. "No processions, no flags, no gilt coaches, no rubies and diamonds and sapphires, no royal robes of purple and gold, such as a loyal country has a right to expect on its sovereign's back. Only that white old thing," said the barmaid. "No better than a velvet nightgown," said the landlady. "I like a bit of colour, I do," said the painter. "Graining I don't ask for he's not had an education to know its beauty. But a good warm maroon, or a royal blue now. But no, it's white, white, white till I'm sick of it, and us all wearing white by law, and washing done free by white magic at the palace on Mondays from 10 to 4, and no one to have more than a quart of beer of an evening. I tell you what it is, my boys, we're miserable, degraded slaves, that's what we are. If we must have a king, said the blacksmith, why not good old Negretti? He's something like a king, he is. Ah, if only he knew how our free hearts beat with him, he'd be sitting on the throne tomorrow. Then Negretti threw off his disguise. The pewter at the municipal arms on it rolled on the sanded floor, and spilt what was left of the dog's nose on to the disguise, and the magician stood before them, pale but firm, his dark lantern in his hand. It was a magic lantern, of course. "Down-trodden slaves," he cried, "poor, benighted, oppressed people, follow me. Let us dethrone a king who seeks to mask tyranny with hypothetical public kitchens, and cloaks of his infamous autocracy with free washing by white magic on a Monday. To the palace! To the palace!" And they all finished up their beer and followed him, and half the town beside joined the throng as it pressed through the streets towards the eastern gate, beyond which was the king's palace. Now while the magician was drinking his dog's nose, disguised as a respectable person, the king in his white robes was walking under the boughs of the white-blossomed pear trees, for it was spring, and the moon was at the full. And presently, coming along over the dewy grey grass of the orchard, he saw a figure in white, and when it came close to him, he saw that it was a lady, more fair than the fair stars of that fair night. "And who are you?" said the king. "I am a poor princess seeking my fortune," said she. "You will rest under my roof tonight," said the king, and led her through the long sweet grass under the blossoming boughs to the palace garden. When they came to the terrace, the princess loosened a lantern from her girdle, set it on the stone balustrade close by where one of the white peacocks perched in fluffy, feathery slumber, kindled it, and threw open the horn door. A flood of light streamed out, bright as spring sunshine, and fell full upon her. And then the king saw that her gown was not white as it had seemed in the moonlight, but was the colour of yellow gold, and her hair was red gold, and her eyes were of gold and grey mingled. Then, for the first time in his life, the king thought of himself and of his own happiness, and he caught her hands and said, "Nothing will ever content me again, not even doing good The princess said, "I am seeking my fortune. Do you think you are it?" "I do not know, my dear," said the king, "whether I am your fortune, but I know well enough you are mine." Then the princess clapped her hands and said, "That is the right answer. I have travelled half round the world to hear it. And will you love me always?" "Always, my queen," said he, "exactly the same as you will love me. We are not of the race that changes heart." So then they kissed each other as lovers should, and wandered along the yew tree avenue, deep in lovers' talk, and never even heard the crowd that the magician had brought to the front door. So when the crowd found that the palace door was locked for the night, it went home again. But it came back in the morning with trumpets and banners and scraps of coloured stuff tied over its white clothing, and the king went out to meet it. When the crowd saw him, everyone began to shout, "Down with Albion! Down with the White King! Free beer! No more washing!" and things like that. Then the king stood forth and said, "What have I done but seek for your good? When till now have I thought of my own happiness? Who has stirred you up to these ill thoughts of me? My people, my own beloved people. Have my ears ever been closed to your complaints? Have you wrongs? Tell me, and I will right them. Have you sorrows? Make them known, and let me soothe them. Do you not know that your king is your servant, and lives but to do you good?" And the crowd grumbled and muttered, and one voice cried, "We don't want to be done good to. We want to enjoy ourselves." "I did not know," said the king gently. "But now you have spoken, I will at once appoint a minister of public enjoyment, and—" The magician was watching the crowd, and he saw how the sight of the king's good face and the sound of his good voice were working on their hearts that had once loved him. Now Negretti sprang forward. He led the king into the shadow of a close-clipped yew-tree walk. The moment they were hidden, he caught his brother's arm and whispered a wicked spell, and the first words of it were in Persian, and the next in Greek, and after that came words in Arabic and Spanish, and the speech of the county of Essex, and the last words of all were, "Be changed into stone." And so strong was the spell that the king was turned to a stone that very minute, a great white stone, and fell under the yew hedge and lay there. And then the magician said, "Ha, ha!" And after waiting so long as he deemed prudent, he went back to the people and said, "I regret to inform you that your king has proved quite unreliable as a man of business. When I urged him to sign a written agreement to keep you always in good humour, he refused. And then he remembered an urgent appointment in Nova Scotia, and he has gone and taken most of the crown treasure with him. But do not despair. I will be your king, and I have an income quite sufficient to keep a small establishment of my own, and my golden argosies are now on the way from the Indies, bearing all manner of precious things, and bales of plush are on their way from Yorkshire. So now I am your king." The people believed him, for they had never known a king who spoke anything but the truth. So they shouted, "Long live the king!" And the matter was settled. That very day Negretti had the palace painted magenta, and covered all the window sashes and mantelpieces with gold paint, and stuck embossed coloured scraps on them. Then he went out into the garden to get a good look at his magenta palace from the outside, and as he went along the clipped yew walk, there was the Princess Perihelia weeping over the white stone. "What are you crying for?" he asked. "I am crying for the White King," she said. "And why do you cry here?" said the magician. "I don't know," said the poor princess, and she looked so beautiful that the magician went straight into the palace and told the prime tailor to sew new rubies all over his new purple plush suit, because he was going a-courting. The very next day Negretti put on the purple plush suit as well as the royal crown, and went to the wing of the palace which the White King had set apart for the Princess Perihelia to live in. Alban's crown was made of silver and pearls and moonstones, and the new king had ordered a new crown, all gold and stuck as full of rubies and emeralds and sapphires as a really good Christmas cake is of plums. I do not mean the cake they call good, wholesome school cake, but the type they have at home when there is a party. He took all his many-coloured retinue with him, and they waited on the terrace while the magician knocked at the door. "Come in," said the princess. "I've come to marry you," said the magician, coming to the point at once, for he had arranged to have a procession that afternoon, and he was a little pressed for time. But Perihelia said, "No, thank you." The magician could hardly believe his ears. "But you'll be queen of the land," said he, "and that's what you would have been if you'd married my brother, and I suppose what you wanted to be." "Oh, no, it isn't," she said. "Well, what did you want?" said he. "I wanted to be the White King's wife," said she. "It's the same thing," he said. But she said, "No, it isn't, not a bit." And it was in vain that he showed her his best plush suit and the plush suits of his retainers. She simply would not look at them, nor at the precious stones either. So at last he went off to his palace to make more rubies and precious stones and things like that. And she went off to cry over the white stone. Now a lot of tell-tale tits had built up their nests above the palace, and some of them flew off and told the magician how Perihelia was always crying in the yew avenue over the white stone. So he said to his slaves, "Get a hand cart and carry the thing on to the middle of the bridge and drop it into the river." So they did, and the stone stuck end up in the mud. And when the golden argosies of the magician came up the river, bearing peacocks and apes and turquoises, every single galley split on that stone, and the whole treasure went to the bottom, all but the peacocks, and they flew away into the country of a neighbouring king, who thought that everyone should be useful and not ornamental. So he cut off the peacocks' tails and clipped their wings, and tried to teach them to lay turkeys' eggs. But it is very difficult to get a peacock to do anything useful. So then the magician set a lot of people dredging for the lost treasure, and among other things they fished up some poor dead apes and the big white stone. And as the stone seemed to have been rather in the way in the bed of the river, they carted it away to the fields behind the town, where the white jonquils grew, and dumped it down there, and left it among the long grass. And the princess could not come and cry over it there, because she did not know where it was, and besides she was very busy, for after she had refused to marry him, the magician said, "Very well then, you can just do the free washing." For the royal housekeeper had given 5 minutes' notice, and left at the end of it as soon as the new king had the palace painted magenta, and no one else knew how to do the washing by white magic. And though the people had sneered at it in the White King's time, they stood out for it now, and said free washing was what they had always been accustomed to. Poor Perihelia did not know the white magic, but she washed by the sunlight magic, and everything she sent home from the wash was pinky or pearly or greeny, like the little clouds in a May dawn. The people were pleased, but not the magician. "I like a colour to be a colour," he said. "I hate your half measures." He was beginning to remodel the kingdom to his own fancy. Instead of a Lord Chief Good Doer, he had a Lord Chief Magician. And instead of the education department, he had a permanent committee of black and coloured magic, and he shut up the free wash-houses. "Who wants to wash?" said he, and he ordered a free distribution of nasty medicine instead. And altogether he was really beginning to enjoy himself, when another tell-tale tit came fluttering in at the window of his laboratory, and, perching on the top of a crucible, told him of a rumour. The rumour had been running about the town like a mad thing, and wherever it ran, it left its tail behind it. Rumour, as you know, is a beast with many tails, and now everybody knew that the white stone had moved in the night and had come rolling up to the gate of the town. "Whatever shall we do?" said the Lord Chief Magician, who was pounding up nasty things in the mortar ready for the free distribution of medicine the next day. "Smash it," said Negretti. "I'll take a turn at the medicine while you go and see the thing is done." So the Lord Chief Magician called together the permanent committee of black and coloured magic and sent them to break the stone. And when they began to hit it with their hammers and picks, 17 sharp splinters of white stone flew off, and each splinter hit a member of the committee in the eye and killed him. There were exactly 17 members as it happened, so the Lord Chief Magician shut the town gates and ran home and hid under the bed. And the people of the town were very much interested in the stone that had rolled by itself and had killed 17 members of the committee. And they made little parties and picnics all day long, taking their children to look at the stone and carrying sandwiches with them and bottles of beer. "Such rubbish I never heard of," said he, when the tell-tale tit alighted on the window-sill and told him of it. "If they want to look at anything, why can't they come and look at me? I'm sure I'm coloured enough." That night the stone rose up in the thickest of the black dark, when no one at all is out of doors except the police, and not always him. And it smashed through the town gate and came rolling right up to the square and lay there. The tell-tale tit awoke the magician in the morning by singing the news sharply in his ear, and he went out to see. there was a great crowd in the square, and they all cried out, "It's a magic stone! It will bring us luck! Build it into the royal palace!" "I might do worse," thought Negretti. "If good Roman cement and a double coat of magenta paint doesn't keep it quiet, nothing will." So he gave orders, and the stone was carted to the palace and built into the wall over the great gate. And while they were gone to fetch the red paint to cover up the stone and the mortar, the Lord Chief Magician came out from under his bed and went sneaking up to the palace and in at the gate, and the stone fell on him and smashed him quite flat. Then Perihelia came running out, and she washed the mortar off the white stone by her sunlight magic. And when the magician came out, she said, "Let it lie here tonight, and tomorrow, if you will let me go, I will take it away to my own kingdom, so that it shall never trouble you again." Negretti agreed, because he did not know what else to do, and he was beginning to despair of the princess ever marrying him, because he had now asked her to do so every day for a month, and always with more display of plush and jewels. That night, just when the moon was waning, and before morning broke, Princess Perihelia slipped down the palace stairs and into the garden to look once more on the place where the White King had promised to love her always. And when she came to that same place, there was the white stone lying under the shadow of the white rose bushes, and the pearly rose leaves had fallen all over it, and were falling still like tears. Perihelia knelt down beside the stone and put her arms round it and said, "Poor stone, dear stone, what is it that troubles you so that you cannot rest? If I only knew, I might help you with my sunlight magic. Why are you so troubled, and why do I pity you so? Oh, if my White King were here, he would understand and help you. But I can do nothing." With that she began to weep over the stone, calling on the White King to come back to her. And all the while she was talking and weeping, the moon was waning, and the light in the east grew pearlier and prettier minute by minute. And as she wept and clasped the stone, she presently saw in the glowing light that the stone was changing in her arms. Like white sands falling in an hourglass, the white stone fell away until the sun looked through the white rose bushes and saw Perihelia clasp the living form of the White King in her loving arms. The sun's was not the only eye which saw that meeting. The magician had had a bad night, and he came out early, curious to see whether the stone had moved again. His curiosity was gratified. When the White King saw his treacherous brother, his tongue was loosed. Hitherto kisses had been speech enough for him, and he spoke the words which he found in his mouth, and they were, naturally enough, the last words that had gone in at his ears, and the words were first Persian, and then Greek, and then Arabic and Spanish, and the language of the foreigners from Essex. And the words he wound up with were, "Be changed into a stone." But the wicked spell that had turned King Alban into a stone had grown weaker by keeping, as even 20 port did when it was kept too long, and it had no longer the power to do what it ought to have done. It could not turn the wicked magician into a stone, as I'm sure you would wish it to have done. It was only strong enough to turn him into a wooden post. I do not wish to have to mention such an unpleasant character as Negretti again, so I will tell you at once the end of him. He remained a post for ever and ever, and later on, when King Alban had begun to do things for his people's good again, he thought it a pity to waste even a post, for he was ever a careful king. So he made it into a pump, and the water from it was bitter and nasty, like the medicine the magician used to give the people. And it was very good for children, and it gave them a nice bright colour in their cheeks. Take care you do not grow pale, or you might have to drink water out of that pump. It is now at Harrogate, or Epsom, or Bath, or somewhere, and you might quite easily be taken there and made to drink that unpleasant water. The first persons who had to drink it were the magician's retinue. The king thought it would be good for them, and they were very grateful. But the next night they stole the state barge and went home by sea to their own country. Among his other improvements, the king started municipal omnibuses, which were white and gold, but the pump being near the place where the omnibuses changed horses, the conductors used to take the bitter water to wash the omnibuses with, and gradually they became scarlet and blue and green and violet, just as you see them today. So now you know the reason of the colour of omnibuses. And this is the end of the magician's part of the story. When the magician had been turned into a post, the king said, I am very sorry. But the princess said, Dear, he deserved it, and being a post is not painful. Let us never again think of him. I have learned many things since I came here. I have something to break to you. Do you think you can bear it? I can bear anything now, said he, holding her in his arms and kissing her again, because she was so very dear. Well, said Perihelia, I am the princess of the sun, and if I marry you, my own dear king, I shan't be able to help colouring your pretty white kingdom just a little. Just soft, sweet colours, dear, and not an inch of plush. We'll make a law against that, the very first thing, and you shall go on teaching your people to be good, and I'll try to teach them to be happy. Do you think I can? The king smiled. You've taught me, he said, but now, before we do anything for the people, let's go and get married, and we can begin to make the new laws directly we've finished breakfast. We shall have just time to be married if we go off to church at once. So they went off and woke up the Archbishop and were married, and the Archbishop came home with them to breakfast, and afterwards they began to make laws as hard as they could. The first law was, there is to be no plush at all in this kingdom. And now Albanatolia is the most beautiful country in the world, all soft, sweet colours and clear pearly white, and the Queen Perihelia has taught the people how to be happy, so the king has very little work to do, for they are good almost without his interfering at all. It is a lovely country. I hope you will go there some day. I went there once, but they would not let me stay, because I had a black coat on and gaiters, and the sight of these clothes made the people so unhappy that the Queen asked me, as a private and personal favour, to go away and never come back unless I could come dressed in something like the colours of the clouds at dawn. I have never been able to manage this, and, anyway, I don't suppose I could find the way there now anyway. But if you could get the proper dress, perhaps you could. Peaceful slumbers. Sleep sweet.